Welcome, everyone, to the Workforce Navigator podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, the host. We have a conversation and a guest today that everyone should be listening into this. We have Ilenia Herrera Lutz on, and you are a transformation HR specialist, everywhere from talent management, workforce management, everything. But you've been working at companies like Accenture, at Duck Creek Technologies. You work a lot on DEI. We were talking before, probably maybe a couple hours, things to talk about here. But what we're going to be talking about today is how HR can embrace and accelerate transforming and scaling companies. That's a huge, huge opportunity. Before we dig into this, though, what I'd love to do is just turn it over to you to explain a little bit more about your background before we get started.
Yes, thank you, Steve. And I appreciate you inviting me. And what a hot topic, right? My name is Ilenia Herrera Lutz. And like Steve said, I am a strategic transformation enthusiast. And my specialty areas have been into coming into teams that had trauma, needed better direction, and come in and build functions from the ground or transform functions or departments. I always been the one that has come in after 2, 3 individuals have been in or where overhaul is needed. And I think my sweet spot is really energizing the team behind a vision, leveraging their strengths and having a roadmap for their skill growing and really have a streamline and optimized processes so they can be empowered to do their best work and support strategic goals for the organization. I'm also a co-author in Anthology for Latinas Rising Up in HR, Volume 3, Executive Decision. And I'm originally from Panama, and I'm a proud Purdue University grad.
Fantastic. Here's why I'm really excited about this conversation is because I think it was last week I had a conversation with a chief marketing officer and a chief revenue officer combination that came onto the podcast. They were talking about how they had in 3 years scaled from 5 million on annual revenue to 100 million, and they were on track to 200 to 250 over the next 2 years. And they said, the transformation inside of our company is absolutely amazing. It's almost like we're an entirely different company as we scale and transform. So that's where I want to start out. What are the biggest challenges that you see in transforming companies that are scaling, and how is HR a really important part of that transformation process?
Absolutely. I think it's important that we take one step back to understand the role in organizations of HR and the changes that have happened in the marketplace, all these social political forces, et cetera, that are impacting corporations today. I mean, let's just take a quick highlight reel. We had COVID, then the whole debacle about working from home, hybrid, remote. Then we had the great resignation in which HR and particularly talent acquisition became a strategic partner. And then obviously the digital transformation that have taken place. And I think on average, we can expect organizations about 30 to 35% continued transformation at some level or another in most corporations. So some of the challenges that I think organizations are facing today is really adopting a mentality of being adaptive, flexible organizational models that are resilient and they're human centric while focusing on continuing that alignment with company goals, short and long term. I think this sounds easier said and done because we have relied on you and I had a extensive conversation about the playbooks and things that companies have relied on for years. There are these macro political economic forces playing. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think the expectation that this is going to be a continuous adaptive process. In addition to that, companies are facing a skilled talent shortage. And I think the imperative word here is skill, those technology, next generation skills. And I collect statistics. I think 76% of CHROs are expecting a talent management competitive landscape and continued shortages from a CHRO perspective. So I think those are really important. And then I think just creating a resilient culture in the organization that continues to adapt. And while dealing with all of these changes, how do you keep your leadership prepared, ready, focused to guide and steer those employees who are fatigued about the historic amount of transformations that we've dealt in the last 5 years alone? How do you continue to reward your high performers and retain them, as well as continue to nurture culture builders. Because I think this conversation of HR is going to continue to be one of culture and people and their engagement throughout their entire employee life cycle.
So here's what I love is the idea of transformations you took in two different really incredible ways. One is outside influencing factors, COVID, things like that. Others are outside factors like digital transformation. Like Deloitte talked about the business of today, the difference between the business of today and the business of tomorrow is their digital transformations. So there's internal things that are happening, there are external things that are happening there. We're changing and adapting as we grow and take on new markets for the business as it expands and it scales. Those transformations from all different sides mean that we have to be adapting and really thinking about one of the most strategic assets we have, which is the people like the deliver. So I'm going to ask you a question and I'm going to have you put this on a scale of 1 to 10. How important is HR in helping companies manage and scale through these transformations? 1, it's not important at all. 10 is actually critical to the overall transformation and scaling the success of the business. How would you put that on that scale of 1 to 10?
Again, I was being facetious. My answer stays the same as a 15 out of your scale because HR is going to be your glue to all of these process from an organizational model, from an internal communication standpoint to retaining, growing, upskilling your employees, your compensation and benefits retention pieces, all those things that attract the best talent. I'm also going to give a shout out to technology. I think those are going to be your two really important strategic partners. I'm not diminishing the importance of other departments. Everybody has different priority departments depending on your line of business. But I think it's the elevation of everything because what we talk about elevated these two functions to be critical partners, not just the doers, not just the cost center, a critical strategic partner.
So I think we all agree here that we can be critical growth transformation partners for the business. Unfortunately, HR is not always perceived that way. What are some of the strategies for HR to support this kind of transformation in business growth?
Absolutely. I think the first one start with leadership. You need that alignment and commitment from the top to not only the strategic goals, but all undercurrent of work that supports that. I think it is important to come in with a mentality that they're no longer siloed departments. And
Right.
I think we've come in into an era of absolute cross-cultural collaboration across functions. That's going to be imperative. From there, I think HR can take the leadership on two very important things. Your organizational model, as it again will repeat these adjectives over and over: adaptive, flexible, resilient, scalable, long term, and all that. Because if you don't have that, then you're going to be running into the same problems that you have had in the past. And then from the second piece, it's the very important people centric or human centric aspect of all of these transformations. When we talk about anything AI related and all the related technologies, that requires some level of compliance and governance training, development, skilling. We are facing, I think in 2 years, we could be having up to 5 generations in the workplace. Then we go into learning and development. Then we go into your succession planning and your performance process. And again, one of the things that speak to my heart always is internal and external communications, because it is as important to share not only the value of your products or your services, but also upholding that employee value proposition, right? In the light of all these changes and reiterations. And at the end of the day, that employee engagement, whether it's adopting technologies, being ambassadors, whether it's supporting recruiting for these challenging skills that everybody's eyeing for, it's going to come from the employee end. And ultimately, when you have employees that are engaged, that shows up in other important ways, which is innovation.
Mm.
Empowered, skilled, well trained, and nurtured employees that see a future in that organization due to that empowerment, and having the tools are going to be really critical for that innovation. And last but not least, I would say technology again, because HR plays an important voice and ally in adopting a lot of these technologies, particularly with collaborative and communication tools. Information sharing is going to be so much important. And that aspect of project management leans on these tools and how information is shared or work streams are tracked. How do you keep that short term, day to day view to the long term view?
Well, here's one of the writing kind of themes I think that you've been talking about. There's a number, but really fostering a strong employee experience. Why do we need to focus on that? How does that lead to the innovation? How does that attract the right talent that can take the AI and the technologies and really use it and flourish from it? In your mind, why do we need a strong employee experience as a foundation to all of this?
Because at the heart of company culture and whether employees choose to adopt is obviously the employees themselves. I think when we think about if HR pushes certain policies or programs, if there's no buy in, then it's just going to be looked at something that is forced down upon them. And I think in innovation, the key thing is think about where do the best ideas always come from, either from your customers or your people working on those things. And when we think about like retention, you and I started in a previous conversation about that path. I'm like, I'm going to get some numbers for Steve. So basically, if you have a $70,000 employee, the turnover cost is literally anywhere between 126,000 to 210,000 plus. And how did I get to this number? You talk about the cost of recruiting. It could be anywhere between 5,000 to $15,000 to replace the employee. Then you go into the onboarding costs and the training costs. Then you go into the institutional knowledge that you lost and how long does it take you to recover it. And then you go into the morale and the productivity loss. So I think in this conversation about transformation, as much as we want to talk about digital transformation, we have to keep that human centric lens. These technologies don't live in a silo, they affect job descriptions, they affect performance, they affect career hierarchical sort of structures within the organization. They affect so many things. So I think at the end of the day, we have to look at the employee to drive these things to validate that there's no biases, because as much as we want to talk about digital transformation, as much as we get these efficiencies in terms of high volume and potentially even accuracy, you still need that human eye to vet it and ensure that it is in the right direction.
So, phenomenal numbers on lack of retention and how much it costs. If we looked at that from kind of 180-degree difference, like this idea of an employee experience that maintains and retains employees, how important is that experience for acquiring the right talent to begin with?
Oh, it is absolutely centered and super critical. When you think about the employee experience, I think where we want to ask ourselves as leaders or emergent leaders is, where do you want to spend your time? Do you want to spend your time with the 3% of the non performers and all the negative noise and issues or situations that arise from that? So I think you have to prioritize hiring the right person with the right skill set. But obviously, that requires a strategic lens. You have to have clarity where your organization is going, how your department fits into that picture, and how this role supports that impact. And then once you have that, then you build your recruiting processes, your employer value proposition, et cetera, to measure and validate that. And then, as we've been talking about, the rest of the employee experience, onboarding, and not only at a large scale with the organization, but also with the team. So that person has clarity on how can they contribute to the impact and bottom line of their department and organization.
So I want to ask you a question. If you've been asked this question before, but do you think that you're talking about here, to me, translates into a competitive advantage in the marketplace?
I think about that as part of what HR is all about. At the end of the day, you land exactly where you just stated, that competitive advantage. If you're a CHRO, you are helping drive your organization to success and to meet their goals. Then you are tracking and measuring that. And I realize that we haven't emphasized that data centric iterative process of measuring, reviewing, tweaking, etc. And then you're creating an advantage for your organization through that strategic human capital in which human resources plays a really critical role. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about is just the nomenclature of human resources. And if that is going to continue to be and remain, and I suspect that it is, but I think it is a fascinating trend that some organizations are looking at this in different ways. Some people are incorporating the word as culture and people and impact, including some of the diversity and inclusion initiatives. Because I think at the center, when we talk about all these things, is really people and the culture and everything that goes under the umbrella of company culture.
What I love about this conversation is that it's such an elevated level of conversation about what HR can do for a company. Where I literally interviewed on this podcast a few weeks ago a chief technology officer that said, "We don't really like HR people." If that chief technology officer was thinking how HR is helping us create a competitive advantage through the very people that we acquire that drive the success of our business, that would be a very different internal alignment and conversation that was happening.
I have a great example for that. In my last organization, there was a department that had so many constraints from a talent acquisition perspective constantly. Very specific technology in environments where the compensation continued to increase. It was constantly moving and losing people, and the level of expertise, it was not something that you can send someone to a boot camp in 6 months. And the leader of that group, I could see he was open, but I also could see his frustration. And with my CHRO, we looked at everything and invited this individual to have a conversation about the challenges. And then we presented opportunities to that individual. And I can tell you it was time well worth, because I think sometimes distance, and that this is one of the why working hybrid or remote presents some challenges. It's really hard to read people and read their energy, their intentions. But when you work with an individual and you are there letting them know, I'm here to work with you to solve these issues, it completely changes the tone. So that's just kind of when you mention that, my immediate reaction, it's like, no, we're in this together, and let's look and put your strategic hat. How can you add value to that person? And obviously, every company is different. We talked about this, depends on the size, depends of your region or a global scope that is going to take you down to different nuances and different pathways. But I think the principles state. And I think one of the things that I want to go back to, and you and I talk about golden unicorns and all that. I think ultimately it doesn't matter if it's a startup that is worth $1 billion or it's a large corporation. I do think there is something to be said about simplicity and keeping things on the fundamentals, because transformations get more complicated when you add more layers of bureaucracy to it.
Absolutely. I want to ask a question on the area of just after working with so many different companies, I know that you had insights that you're like, if I could just tell them ahead of time, these are the kind of things you need to be thinking about. What are the kind of insights that you would just want to share for scaling organizations?
I would say lean into HR for sure. At the end of the day, we touch all aspects of your employees' lives and life cycle. We can help mitigate, prevent, if you practically tell us, and manage some of the noise or some of the non-productive activities for you. So you as a leader or leaders can focus on the core functions of your department. And I think we need to think about it as a partnership. So that will be my call to other leaders. And the second piece of this, well, we already talked about internal communications. And the third piece, leadership really needs to step up with their hat that they are fully accountable for that leadership. I think this works when everyone is alignment and willing to do every aspect of the word that is required. But I often seen in organizations where leaders don't want to be leaders, or sometimes people are learning to be leaders. It doesn't have to be a malicious thing, but there are basic things such as trickling down communications, keeping confidentiality, and not being scared of coach. And sometimes you have to deliver negative news about someone's performance. So I think it is very critical for leaders to take full accountability of the full spectrum of the responsibility of leaders, not only for their function, but for their teams. And it's not easy. I think everybody has to work on their leadership style, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the same spot, that accountability and action.
I want to ask maybe one of the most important questions. What do you want to make sure that you're conveying about HR's role in scaling and transforming companies that we haven't talked about yet?
Wow, that is such a loaded question. I think is making sure that you're truly nurturing that employee experience. The experience really starts from the moment someone applies all the way to when the person exits the organization. And I think you succeeded when that person that is leaving chooses to recommend your organization as a great place to work. It may not meet their needs at this present time, and they leave with positive feelings. I mean, when there's a departure story, I think we need to walk away that there has to be a villain in the story. And I think that is a great measurement of your success. You succeeded as a supportive, empathetic employer when the individuals walk away and have that feeling. There's other recommendations that I can give, but I think the employee experience is going to continue to be front and center. And as employers, people are going to have to make tough decisions, particularly what rewards. There's so many discussions about the multi generations and how they need to approach them. And that is very close to the employee experience, their preferences of communicating, their preferences of learning philanthropy. So when you're building your organizational models, you really have to take that piece into account, because that whole playbook of one size fits all, very hierarchical sort of company structure is really not going to be working. As a matter of fact, I think with anything digital, we're going to get flatter and short circuiting a lot more of the decisions, because with more information and kind of that processing power to dissect data, to analyze things, we should have more time for responsibilities and tasks and focus in our work.
Yeah, I got to tell you what came to mind right as you were answering that question. You talked about we have to think about that departure story. And not only do we retain information 22 times better when it's told to us in the form of a story, but that departure story, I started to think of like there should be an employee NPS score.
And you know what? With these digital transformation, any human centric sort of metric is a value add. Yes, I'm in favor of that one. That should be part of the metrics.
So, of everything that we've talked about here, it's been a lot. If you wanted other HR leaders that are watching this right now, what is the one most important takeaway that you want them to have?
Wow. I don't know if I can package it in one way. I think if I have to choose a word, I would say I would choose two: proactive and resilience, because the change is not going away. And it's been interesting seeing this digital transformation because it accelerated really quickly. And I think most CEOs and CHROs are clear that there will be very visible impacts to this digital transformations to jobs and roles. I think people tend to think about it in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And I think in 5 years, we will see that. But it took speed really quickly. And if you notice, now we're a little stuck because people are not quite sure how to do that. There's continues to be debates in organizations. Who is going to own the AI piece? I encourage HR leaders to take it on and own it. It will be an excellent excuse to partner cross-functionally with the rest of the organization. At the end of the day, again, I think we said this at least 2, 3 times. It is going to come back to that employee experience. And from the application, I mean, now we're looking at AI beyond the top of the funnel. we're moving to interviews now and the benefits from that and reporting, analysis. So I think that is something critical to keep in mind.
I actually have one more question for you because we're talking so much about the importance of employee experience. What is the difference between employee experience and culture? Or are those the same thing?
No, they're not the same. Your employee culture should be strategic and long term. It's your code of conduct to drive your day to day to long term activities. Your employee experience should be based out of that. But as we know, employees have everyday positive or negative experiences. So they're, to me, distinct and separate, but they do go hand in hand because at the end of the day, I do strongly believe that employees are the one that ultimately manage and experience the culture.
I love these questions of the 1 to 10. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is the culture that the experience is really the result of that culture? How important is the company culture that develops the right experience on a scale of 1 to 10? 1, it's not important at all. 10, it's vital to create the right culture, leading to the right experience that drives the transformation and the success of the business.
It is super vital. And I think you pose that question because we've seen when there isn't clarity what that company culture is and what is the vision for that culture. I think it is okay for company leaders to be courageous and admit when that company culture needs pivots. Obviously, we tend to react easier to technology changing needs, but when there are or regulatory ones, because of course you have to do it. But it is interesting how we've gone from that intrinsic, just pure shareholder value to broadening that conversation. That is not just the shareholders, it's also broadening it to encompass the entire community in which the company culture interacts with. So we're talking about vendors, we're talking about philanthropy. We're talking about sustainability and all of those things.
So, if you were going to recommend to other HR professionals to arm them to go to their leadership to say, this is why company culture is so important and we have to be proactive. Not only resilient, but that proactive piece that you talked about earlier, what would you recommend to them?
I would recommend that they need to push for a clear, crisp vision and a very compelling business case of why. I think it is easier to show the areas of the business that are underperforming or are even toxic in terms of missed opportunities, and then turn it around and say, here are the things that we can do to improve that company culture and what all the things that we have to gain by taking down that path. Change is hard. I mean, you and I had an extensive conversation about fatigue. It's not just the employees, CHROs, middle management. The level of burnout, it's super high. I don't want to say historical because I'm not a statistician, but it is everywhere. And I think this is why we're having these conversations about anxiety, well-being, mental health. And the younger generations are really pushing that holistic approach to organizations and what their employee experience is. More and more, they want to work for organizations that their mission, their values align. They don't want to just write a check for philanthropy, they want to be involved. They're very wary of performative diversity tasks or actions. They really want systemic change, whether it's an employee investments, representation, compliance, sustainability. And at the end of the day, to answer your question, when you have employees that are thriving, this is where innovation comes into place. There's so many numbers out there when you have innovative, creative, diverse, inclusive work cultures and how that impacts the bottom line, the revenues, and the creativity and innovation within the organization. So that is the summary of the business case, really. But obviously, as we say, it manifests in different ways depending on your organization and the industry you're in.
It's good to be proud of being HR. I love it.
I am very proud to be in HR. That's one of the things that I always fought when I've got into organizations. And I have to say that either the function that was in, it was not perceived positively. And I do take it as a personal challenge to overcome that. For me, for my peers, I was trying to find it and I couldn't. There was someone in LinkedIn the other day, and I wanted to give this individual credit that talked about all the negative perceptions about HR. And then he proceeded to list all the things that actually HR does for employees. And I can speak for me. I'm sure, Steve, probably you and I have a lot in common, but at the end of the day, we like to help people. We like to open up opportunities for individuals. And I think this is why I actually switched from change management consulting to a career in HR, because to me, that is really, I'm passionate about that. And I find that most rewarding when you took actions within your tools and programs and initiatives and the resulting case. And I think one of the questions you asked me is, what am I the most proud about? I think in my HR career, and I took some time to think about it. And I have to go back in every place where I've done this is important. But I think because of the scale, I will have to say it at Accenture. I started owning campus programs and then I started focusing on diversity initiatives. And that process of opening up so many doors from an entry level, then it transformed to conferences to then experience. And looking at that, I think this is why I'm so passionate about the employee experience, because we did said you do the pre-work, like what's not working, why are people leaving? You do that analysis, you do your listening loops, and then you take the processes and start solutioning and coming up with mitigations and implementing programs. But the fact that, you know, the ability to touch someone from the moment you meet them and you give them feedback on their interview or their resume, and they see that you're invested in them and you connect them with other people, because it's really hard to go into an organization and you only know one person, your recruiter, and that you have a myriad of resources and contacts and network. And then that goes beyond their first day. You're invested in their success, that you're connecting them as an employee to affinity groups, to mentors, to industry specialists. You guide them through how to do their best to prepare for the performance process. And then I have people that now are bordering line. I have some managing directors on my first tenure at Accenture, but on my second tenure, some of them are about to reach managing director. And that is really exciting to see. So I wanted to get back to that because I think we all need to remind ourselves of how HR adds value and the times that we do help people and make a difference, because that's really what we find satisfying at the end of the day. But I think I speak for many and most in HR with these sentiments. How about you, Steve?
I would agree 100% with you. I think we need to have a five-part series here to cover and go in depth on everything. I just want to say thank you for coming on today and sharing just a wealth of knowledge that you have. I think your background as a change management consultant and now HR is absolutely invaluable for the insights you've shared here. I know people are going to have questions. Would it be appropriate that I gave a link out to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out to you?
Absolutely. I am a believer that no one goes and becomes successful by themselves. So I'm happy to make connections. I'm happy if somebody wants to brainstorm or Ilenia, what do you think about this? Or has this worked for you? Or what are some drawbacks? I'm more than happy to share my knowledge or my connections with our professional networks.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm very excited about this podcast on your entire series. So hopefully more people catch on of the invaluable insights that you're sharing, and you're doing it in the spirit of sharing, which is great.